Hey, CNFers. It's the Creative Nonfiction Podcast, the show where I speak with the world's best artists about creating works of nonfiction, leaders in the world of narrative journalism, personal essay, memoir, radio, and documentary film, so you can apply their tools of mastery to your own work. I dig it. I hope you do too. Thank you for listening. Episode 73 comes at you with Patsy Sims. She is the author of The Clan, Can I Get an Amen? Inside the Tents and Tabernacles of American Revivalists. And most recently, she's the editor of The Stories We Tell, True Tales by America's Greatest Women Journalists, published by the Sager Group. Patsy has been such a champion of creative nonfiction that it's easy to forget that she was one of the pioneers in the 60s and 70s. She was the Dumbledorian headmaster of Goucher College's creative nonfiction MFA program, and few people, myself included, ever asked her about her origins and her own writing. But that's sort of the myopic nature of MFA students. Again, myself included. This is my way of atoning. That's neither here nor there. In this episode, we talk about book projects as mini educations, paying attention to people who aren't paid attention to, building relationships, persistence, and her fascinating approach to digesting notes, and a lot more. As you know, it's about this time I kindly ask for reviews, as they are the currency that validates this whole enterprise. It takes less than 60 seconds, and it helps out so much. There are already 19 ratings and reviews, and none of them, quote, none of them are from family members. Scouts honor. Also, I have a pretty slick monthly newsletter where I share my monthly reading recommendations and what you might have missed from the world of the podcast. I'd love for you to join the growing list. It's once a month, no spam, can't beat it. So, that's where we're at. In this episode, number 73, we start with me asking her what clicked in her as a young person to tell these kinds of stories.
I think maybe it started when I was a child. I mean, I grew up in the South, and, I'm sure you've heard Southerners love storytelling, and, perhaps that was the first thing. And then as I went along, I think one, that we never grow out of liking stories, but I really love people. I'm fascinated by people. I love learning about things, and I think all of those things combined drew me into doing narrative nonfiction. When I went to college, I majored in journalism, but I think before college I always thought, I wanted to be a writer since I was a child, but I think I thought I was going to be a fiction writer. And I majored in journalism initially because I thought I have to have a way to support myself, to eat. And so I thought I'll major in journalism and I can support myself in journalism. But, then I got hooked on it, and I loved the reporting. I love the reporting almost as much as the writing. And so that's how I got started in nonfiction. And then in the late 60s when Capote published In Cold Blood, I think that really showed me that I could do anything with nonfiction that the fiction writer does, except I can't make it up. And, I think that was all of what led me to where I am now.
What about the reporting process drew you so? What part about that process did you find so addicting? Because you were just saying that that information gathering phase was almost like better than the writing. So what about that part really hooked you?
I'm curious. I love to learn about people. I love to learn about new things. And, it's like each story, each book that I embark on, I'm able to have, many education. And I love that, discovering things and learning about things. In terms of people, I love to get at what makes people tick. I love to learn about them and find out about them, and try to find out what compels them to do the things they do and what made them the way they are. It's sort of a discovery. It enabled me to get a lot of educations without having to earn master's degrees, I guess you'd say.
And what about certain subcultures or certain people? What subcultures are you most attracted to exercise that degree of creativity that draws you to the reporting?
One, I've had a real interest in race relations, and so that was really, I guess, at the heart of me wanting to do a book on the Ku Klux Klan. And I think it's those interests. I guess I also am interested in people who are everyday people, the kind of people who they make the news only with their birth and death announcements, and I don't even know that that's happening anymore. So they're people that nobody would pay attention to, and I with the Klan and also with Revival, I wanted to get into them to find out what drew them, what made a Klansman or Klans people have the feelings that they have and to feel so strongly about them, and what made them tick. And in certain respects, I guess the same kind of feelings about people in Revival. So I think it's really, I guess, if you look at my work over time, it has been people who are low on the totem pole, who their lives are pretty drab, and to try to get into them and find out why they go in the directions they go. When I was doing the Revival book, which came after doing the Klan book, I noticed that there were a lot of similarities between the Klan people and the Revival people in terms of background, education or lack of education, financial status, and I also was in some of the same locations where I had gone to Klan rallies, and then in the same location I would go to a Revival with 3,000 people. And it occurred to me that, they had to be related. They had to know one another. And why did one person go to the Klan and why did one go to the Revival? So it's, I guess, that I've thought these things out because I'm eager at finding the answers to those kinds of questions.
Mm. A big challenge with doing that kind of a deep dive into these kind of subcultures is a matter of access, and not just, and echoing what Lee Gutkind told me, was it's not just getting access, it's finding people who actually want to be written about. It doesn't matter how much you want to write about them. Like, if they don't want to be written about, then you're stuck. So how have you over the years engendered that sense of trust that allowed you to get access to these subcultures, and also to find the people who want to be written about, and then get access to them to write about them?
Wow. Okay. To back up, I think that initially it was important to me to build up contacts and sources, and so I think that they're common thread, common tie in a lot of things that I've done, and so I built up a Rolodex. And initially, like on the Klan book, I would call my sources in the South, the people who I had done various stories with, and get their suggestions on who I should go talk to. And initially, I thought that I really needed an entree. I needed these people who I knew to sort of vouch for me and introduce me to these people in order to get them to talk to me. But I found as I went along that I really didn't need that I could do it on my own. And I think that, to me, the way that you gain access, and sometimes the people who think they don't want to be interviewed, is to be really down down to earth, to be very genuine, and to really come across as someone who's interested in finding out about them and their stories. And I think being a good listener is really, important. So I guess on all of these, I've called people. I've tried to be sincere on the phone with them, and I think a lot of people were surprised, for instance, when I did the claim, and that I got the people to talk to me, and that they said some of the things they said to me into a tape recorder. And in that case, I think it was a matter, one, that I did try to be sincere. And when they would say, ask me my beliefs, I do believe in always being honest about where you stand. I don't think you need to broadcast it, but I would say I don't share your beliefs, but I want to hear you about why you believe what you do. And that seemed to satisfy them. So I think it's that, developing them having confidence in you and trust in you, and you're willing to be fair to them. I really can't think of anybody. I'm sure they have them, but I can't think of standouts of people who absolutely refused to talk to me. I also, along that line, believe in being persistent and keep trying until you can get them to talk to you. And I think when I say that, I think about the television evangelist, Ernest Angley, who I'm not sure if he is still around or still broadcasting. But when I was doing my revival book, I was trying to get him for an interview, and he kept turning me down, or his people kept turning me down. So I went around him, and I interviewed a lot of people who knew him or had crossed paths with him, and I was almost through with my book, and I gave it one last chance, or one last try, and I wrote him a letter and told him that I was completing my book, and that I was very sorry that he had chosen not to talk to me, that I had talked to people who knew him, etc., but that was not the same as talking to him. So, he knew then that he was going to be in the book, whether he talked to me or not. He did not know who I talked to or what they said, and I very quickly got a phone call saying, he will talk to you, and so I got it. And so I guess the lesson there too is perseverance, not giving up, but and so strategizing.
Yeah, and it's also being confident enough to be patient and play the long game, right? Yeah. You have to be patient. You have to not give up. In tracking people down, but in this kind of writing period, you're talking about long-range things that are going to take a long time. If you want another example of one who I just kept out, it happened down in Mississippi with the White Knights in Mississippi, which was the most violent, secretive, plan in the 60s, and so much of the violence that we read about and heard about during the Civil Rights Movement was the work of the White Knights. And so when I worked my way down to Mississippi to do interviews, I thought, these people, they're going to be crawling out of the woodworks. I, have no problem. And when I got there, I learned they were very secretive. I could not get anybody to talk to me or to admit that they were in the Klan. But I managed to have the number of a guy, Edgar Ray Killen. And so I tried him, and I could tell on the phone he would say, I'd really like to talk to you, but I can't. But I could tell that this guy was curious about me. And so I kept calling. And I was finished with Mississippi, went to Texas, did everything. And then I was actually had passed through Mississippi, was in Alabama on my way back to Pennsylvania, where I lived at the time. And I decided, okay, I'm going to try one more time to call Edgar Ray Killen.
and I called Edgar Ray Killen, and of course, he did not know if it, of course, there was no caller ID. He didn't know where I was, and I told him, that I really still wanted to interview him. And so he said, I think I can do it tonight. Well, I got my little MG and headed back west and drove to Mississippi. I had no place to interview him except my motel. And that's still another story. But at any rate, I got a 4-hour interview with Edgar Ray Killen, and he is now in prison. He was just convicted a few years back for the murders of the 3 civil rights workers in Philadelphia, Mississippi in 1964. But that, is another example of, if you just keep trying, it will eventually pay off. More times than I think you would think.
Where did that tenacity come from for you?
My mother.
Mm-hmm.
I come from this long line of, I guess you'd say, adventurers. They just, they kept moving west, and my mother was not afraid of the devil, and she just was full piss and vinegar, I guess you would say, and I think I inherited that from her. She just went after it. She wasn't a writer or anything like that. I mean, her level of writing was recipes in McCall's magazine. But I think I get that part of me from her, I would say.
When you decided to pursue journalism, and any conversations you might have had with your mom, was she outright offering you that kind of counsel of saying, like, well, Patsy, if you're gonna do this, like, make sure you really sink your teeth into this and like really go at it with a sense of the rigor that you grew up with? Or did she offer you any of that kind of counsel?
No, actually, my mother didn't want me to be a writer. My mother wanted me to be a ballet dancer. She wanted me to go to New York and dance. It was greatly disappointed when I did not go in that direction. The writing part came from my father. He was an avid reader. Earliest memories of my father sitting in his comfortable chair reading Saturday Evening Post, and he also, I'd say, from most of his life, subscribed to Book of the Month Club. He read incredible books, and he had an incredible library. So it was really by his example, and, ultimately he gave me a dictionary. He gave me my first typewriter, and he encouraged me to write. What I didn't know, really, until after I decided I wanted to be a writer, that he had wanted to be a writer, and was absolutely thrilled when I became one, and loved, sort of vicariously sharing my experiences. We ended up corresponding, I'd say, for 30 years, sometimes 2 or 3 letters a week. And a good deal of that, I'm going back through some of those now, really is about what I was doing, writing-wise and work-wise. So he was a great encourager.
That's what's incredible about that is that I think maybe for a long time he had maybe harbored this, like, maybe hope that you would pursue that line of work, but didn't shove it down in your throat like like a little league coach, like a father coaching his kid in baseball or something. Like, you will play ball, you will try to live out my dreams that failed, but he just gave you a couple tools and let you make the choice. So that was like a real great Jedi mind trick that he used.
Yeah, you're right. I wonder if he consciously do that. But he loved writing, and later he became such a supporter that, it was funny, and sometimes I was embarrassed, but he became this. In his later years, after he retired, he had worked for the Western Union, and after he retired, he became a great letters to the editor writer. Actually, really good letters, during the Vietnamese War and everything. And letters, at that point, he was living in Houston, and the editor of the editorial department would sometimes call him and say, Mr. Mr. Sims, would you be interested in writing us a letter about blah, blah, blah? You know how you feel about that. But so the letter writing then carried over to me, and he started sometimes writing my editors about something I'd written. I did a 15-part series on sugarcane workers in South Louisiana that ran in the evening paper in New Orleans. I mean, it was a big series, and long. Each day it was this long piece. And so one day the editor of the editorial, the one that handled the letters to the editor, came over to my desk and said, "Patsy, you have a strange letter. I don't understand it." He handed me this letter, and it said, "Dear editor, that piece you're running on sugarcane workers is the best thing you've ever run. I may be prejudiced, sincerely, or racist." And I said, "Gene, that's my daddy." And another time, he really wanted me to work for the Washington Post. And at that point, I really didn't have any interest in working for the Washington Post. I had a job in New Orleans that I really liked. And at any rate, I came home one day and had an envelope from my father, opened it. There was a application to the Washington Post and a letter from Ben Bradley. Huh. And so Bradley said, "Dear Mr. Sims, thank you for your suggestion. We've already filled the position left by Sally Quinn." This is when he and Sally Quinn decided to get married. And but if Miss Sims does apply, here's an application. And so I called my father, and I said, "Daddy, what did you say to Ben Bradley?" He said, "Dear Mr. Bradley, I understand Sally Quinn's left, and you have an opening. Not only can Patsy Sims do anything that Sally Quinn can, she can do it a heck of a lot better." Signed it all. Anyway, so he went overboard sometime, but that was my gung-ho father. Ironically, a little bit around that time, I got a job offer for the Philadelphia Inquirer, and I took the place of a woman who had been hired to take Sally Quinn's place. So it was kind of a funny chain of events.
Clearly, your father was in your corner. Who else?
Yes.
Yeah. Who else at a young age gave you that permission to keep going and keep exercising your talent and your craft to keep growing in this in this form of journalism?
Oh, geez. You talk when you say young age with JJ. 5'10". I would say, I started working on the New Orleans paper at the beginning of the fall of my junior year in college when I started majoring in journalism. And I was very fortunate that right about that time, there had been two afternoon papers in New Orleans that merged into what became the Stateside, which is what I worked for in all the years that I was in New Orleans. And they had an opening in my journalism professor, the head of the journalism school, called me in and said, "Would you be interested in working in the paper?" And, God, I thought I had to pay anybody to, give me the paper. At any rate, they had called and they needed somebody to work 20 hours a week. And so I did, and it was in what in those days were called the old, women's sections, which are the, predecessors to the feature sections today. But at any rate, the editor of that section at that point was a woman named Lorraine Borrow. Lorraine was a real big encourager also. She also taught me a lot, I think, that influenced the kind of writer I got to be. I mean, she was a real human interest, people kind of person, and wrote a column that were a little, sort of vignettes and everything. And so, I think I owe a lot to her. I mean, she's been dead a long time now. But I think that she encouraged me. She let me do things that, I was really, gosh, I'm trying to think how old I would have been. Very, like 21, 20. Maybe 21. I don't know, somewhere around that age. But she let me do a lot a lot of things. And she really, I think, was a great, she really encouraged me, and by her example, to focus on people in a way that was just not quote, to get at them and what they were like and what they looked like and that kind of thing. The other thing she let me do is, we were both of us believers that the women's section didn't have to be women's stories. We sometimes drove the editor of the paper crazy because he would come in there waving the newspaper saying, "This is not a women's story." And, I was writing about drug addiction, the criminally insane, all of these things in the women's section. But what I would do to get around him is I would find a woman. For instance, the story about the criminally insane, I found a woman, a female lawyer, who was very interested in the cause of the criminally insane and how they were treated at the state mental hospital. And so I used her as an excuse for writing this story. So, I did those kinds of things. I wrote about drug addiction. At one point, I was guest of honor at a Christmas party given at Gallup Prison in Louisiana by their Narcotics Anonymous chapter because of stories that I've written in the women's section about drug addiction. So anyway, I'd say, Lorraine was certainly one of those who encouraged me.
So for people who might not recognize, might not know, how would you define what, when you were in your 20s, how would you define what a women's story was at that time?
Women's story at that time was recipes, fashion, raising babies, a profile of a woman, soft subjects. And we did some, obviously, but, when I look back on the stories that I did, and, I've already named some, at one point, I did a series on the use of hypnosis in medicine and dentistry. And all of this was in the women's section. Obviously, there are times that I did have to write about fashion and food. When I say that I had to write about food, I think about in those days some of the little taboos that we cannot use. I don't know about the men's section, but you could use in the women's section, or you have a story you have to write a headline on it about meatballs and spaghetti, and you could not say meatballs. You could not use the word balls. And those are some of the things. But to give you a contrast, at one point, I got married right after I graduated. I married a guy who worked in the morning paper, and he did not believe that we should, in the paper, we were all on the same floor at the newspaper, the morning and the evening paper. He didn't believe that the two of us should work together on the newspaper, and of course, I was the one that needed to leave the newspaper, and this was before I became a liberated woman. And so I went to work for 2 miserable years with the State Board of Health, writing pamphlets about rabies and that kind of thing. And fortunately, they ran out of money and had to let me go. And then my former husband, was more than willing for me to go back to the newspaper because he wanted another paycheck in the family. But at any rate, at that point, I ended up working 1 year on city desk. And what they gave women to do was pitiful. I spent that year every 2 hours checking the temperature and giving it to the city editor. One time they had a bad hurricane or some kind of storm that blew all the trees down, and they had a plant a tree contest, and every day I had to come up with a new lead about a tree in this fundraiser to replace the trees. And anyway, at the end of the year, they had an opening in the women's section, and Lorraine wanted me to come back into the women's section. And the city editor, or I guess by that time the managing editor, came over to me and said, Lorraine wants you back there, but you don't have to go back to the women's section. You can stay on city desk. And I said, no, thank you. I think I'll go back to the women's section because they weren't letting me do the kinds of stories that I could do back in the women's section.
That's amazing. That must have been a kind of a tough time, like a really, like, you know, you were on such a, I don't know, this short leash that you couldn't shake for a while there. Like there were these stories that you really wanted to get at, and then you're writing leads for trees and checking the thermometer, and finally you were able to get back to the women's desk where you could do these types of more hard reporting stories. What was that like when you were back on the women's desk with Lorraine and finally able to cut loose a bit?
It was great. We were winning awards with these stories. We were beating people from the city desk, with stories we were doing in the women's section. A little bit after I got back, I don't remember the exact timing, Lorraine became very ill and essentially did not ever really return as women's editor. When she was able to, she would write a column. So I became women's editor, which then, I was able to hire people who, and of course I would hire kindred spirits, and we would do these things. At one point, actually early on, we wrote a long series, each of us doing some stories on abortion. This was like, I can't remember, late 69 or 70 or something like that. So, the way what it was, I mean, it was just a sense of freedom, even though we had to be cagey with our freedom and how we did it,
Yeah, that must have been like. How did you? It's talk about an inflection point there, just in terms of culture, and also just probably like where you felt you stood in that culture. Like, well, how hard was it to navigate what you wanted to do versus what was expected of you to do?
How hard was it? I think more than anything, I had to be willing to just let the editors go in one ear and out the other ear. I guess this is my mother in me again. That I just did it. I found ways around it, and he never fired me. I was glad that I was there, and I could have other stories for other people, besides not just mine. At one point, when I applied filed for divorce, around that time, I ended up out in San Francisco for a couple of years. And again, I found myself very early on becoming acting women's editor. And again, it was that kind of section. But I did the same thing. And there was the owner of the paper at that point. Everybody in the paper, including the managing editor, was scared of this guy. They all just quaked in their boots. Mr. Terry, is going to come get us. Mr. Terry, even when he was at his, I can't remember, he had a mountain home somewhere, but he had the paper flown to him every morning. And if he didn't like something, he would call the managing editor. At any rate, I did my usual thing, and I can remember my managing editor was just right. My desk was right not far from his door, and he called me, and I don't remember what the story was, but he called me in and he said, I know this is good journalism, but I'm not going to take up for you with Mr. Terry when he calls this morning. But the irony of it was, Mr. Terry really respected me because I didn't back down from him, and he ended up wanting, when I left the paper, approaching me about coming back and being assistant city editor, which I didn't do. There was an interesting period of time, and women, I think, as bad as it was for women, I don't think, and I don't know where this comes from except my mother, I don't ever feel like I felt like there wasn't anything there were things I couldn't do. Maybe it was just a determination that I was going to do, I was going to try it, I was going to go down fighting and everything, but, and I'm not sure completely where else to say that came from. I don't recall ever feeling like either of my parents taught me that I was a girl, and there were certain things I had to do. I don't recall them instilling that in me.
How long after In Cold Blood comes out do you start to turn around the idea in your head like, oh, I want to start doing stuff like that?
Oh, I don't know. I think it was probably immediate. I mean, I had been the Capote of his short stories, and really reluctantly read In Cold Blood because I liked his short stories and his little novelettes. I think about even, and I don't know where it came from, but I went to Tulane, and I did features, and I remember some of the stories that I did. Even then, I was playing with narrative. I don't know that I knew what it was or thought about it, but I can remember one story that it was like homecoming, and I had to go around and write about the fraternity houses getting ready for homecoming or something. And I just remember me trying to get at how the hammer sounded and all that kind of thing. So, I'm not sure. I guess I was fooling around with it, but I think in terms of Capote that it made me think more about that I could do it in more serious journalism, and that I could do it in book form, and that the novel I always wanted to write didn't have to be fiction, that it could be nonfiction. So I guess the really first serious thing I did, and that was 1968, was when I came back to New Orleans from San Francisco. I worked out there 2 years, and then the state got created a job for me called Special Assignment Writer, which was like freelancing and getting a paycheck at the end of every week. And I had a lot to say about what I did, and they didn't care how long it took, and they let me experiment. And so I came back, I remember, I guess in July or August of the summer of 72, and one of the first things I did was a series on race relations, and that, I guess, was about a 10 or 11 part series. But then after that was when the sugarcane thing came up. And the sugarcane series was really my first real try at this. And I was working with an editor who was not that much older than I, and he just gave me free rein to do what I wanted to do with that. And so, as far as I Capote, here's my chance to be Capote. And as I said, it was 15 parts, but we had characters that continued all the way through it. And instead of calling it first of a series or second of a series, we called it Chapter 1, Chapter 2. And I got more feedback from that, more response from that than I think anything that I did in my entire newspaper career. I mean, the letters to the editor were incredible. Some of them were good, some of them were outraged because the sugar growers are so powerful. Yeah, that was really my first chance to really try doing something like Capote did.
Yeah, what does that say about the power of narrative? I mean, we see it with, these days, Roy Peter Clark's done this, does this kind of work, Tom French, and countless others. And this really tends to really just strike a chord with readers and taps into something that gets beyond the cerebral brain and more to the heart. And and so what do you think it is about this kind of work that just, I don't know, it fires people up and moves people?
Yeah, I do. I mean, I think people can identify better. When you're talking about people and you're taking the reader into the lives of the people that you're writing about. I not only because of Capote, but just because of my own reading habits. I knew that when I they could have a newspaper or whatever can have a wonderful series, and I was, wow, what a wonderful series. I'll read the first story. The next day, I'll read the lead and maybe a couple of paragraphs. And the next day, I read the lead. And the next day, maybe just a headline. And I really felt this was an important story. And I felt writing this in the traditional feature story, method, way, or style, was not going to hold readers in the way that I wanted them to hold. And so, I thought, let's just see what narrative will do, if this will hold them. And it did. The paper ended up reprinting the whole series, and, I don't remember how many thousand that they printed of that. We went through that, but it did, I think it just, as I said, it draws people into the lives of other people in a very intimate way and takes them along on their story. And as I said earlier, we all like stories. And so, they were compelled to read not just the lead, but they had to read the whole story to get to the end, to see how it ended. And then I'd say from then on, I really tried to do that. I did another series on the lives of police officers, and attempted to do the same kind of thing, doing narrative and spending great periods of time with police officers and stuff. But I just think it's magic. I think to me, the very power of narrative is that you can get people to read about stories, about subjects that they never in the world would have read otherwise, that they never thought they were interested in. And you hook them in the beginning, and you just don't let them go until you get to the very end.
How do you, with this type of long-form writing, how do you, in the process of research and reporting, start reporting for narrative and start seeing, like, sort of, maybe a lack of a better term, like shaping your reporting for the longer arc? Like, is there a tactic you use to sort of approach this, knowing that you're going for, this big sweeping arc?
I go in and I don't try to preconceive how it's going to end. I'm not thinking of narrative arc when I start, because I think to have a preconceived idea, you can cut yourself off from some good material and a good story. I start out, the tools that I use, I interview, I'm a big believer in tape recorders, not just for an interview, but to pick up scenes so that I have the noise and the quotes and everything that's going on so that I can recreate a scene. I take photographs, and I tack the photographs, above or beside my computer so I can see the people as I write about them for description and everything. I take notes. I tend to over-research, but I collect a lot of different material because I want what I need to recreate what I experienced. I really am not completely sure how it's going to go together until I have everything together. I go through a period of where I'm transcribing my notes. Let me back up. And so while I'm on the road, I do every night, if I'm on the road, go back to my motel. And in the early days, I was carrying a big IBM typewriter with me because I didn't have a portable. But whatever I had, a typewriter or a computer, I sort of debrief myself. I type over my written notes, and then I write about things that maybe I didn't write down. I think about what I smelled, what I heard, how I felt, how he looked, expressions and that kind of thing. I try to get as much down as I can in my notes and in my transcripts. As I'm transcribing, I'm doing more than transcribing what they say. I'm transcribing the tone of voice. I'm describing how perhaps he pounded his fist on the desk as he said, that kind of thing. All of these things that are a detail that when I'm recreating a scene, I have them have them there. I can relive what happened, and so I get all of that together, and then I go through this period of, oh my God, I wish the house would burn down and destroy all of the. I have to tackle it into a story or a book. Am I going to be able to do this? Is this the time? It's not going to work, And so far, knock on wood, somehow God strikes me and something happens. But the other thing I'm a big believer in is letting, sometimes, you pound yourself over the head because you're not coming up with an opening or a paragraph or a phrase or a passage is not writing itself. And what I've learned is all of that is really part of the writing process. And even when things aren't working and you think you're not thinking about it, your subconscious is working. And so I try not to beat myself up when it doesn't come as quickly as I wish it would. And I'm also a great believer in at night before you go to bed, reading over the material, reading over what you have, reading over the passage, and thinking about that, because I think there's a way that when you're sleeping, again, this is all going through your mind, and I find that sometimes when I do that I wake up in the middle of the night with an idea, or early in the morning, and so, that's sort of my approach to getting going, writing-wise. And I love it when it first, when it really starts moving, when you wake up and paragraphs are writing themselves in your mind. Sometimes when that really gets going, I will leave my computer, my office is at the opposite end of the bedroom. I will leave it on and get up and come in and not turn the light on, and sometimes keep my eyes closed and write. It's going through my head. And I think when all of that starts happening and phrases start turning, to me, it feels like I'm on the high wire, anyway, to me, it's an exhilarating feeling.
Wow. And I wanted to get back to a point you made about recorders and having, being a fan of, as both of us I'm sure are, of like John McPhee, and he just had a new book come out about the writing process. And he's for years has been adamant about not using recorders because he thinks reporting is a selective process and recorders don't select. They're like a fishing net that just trolls everything. And he just thinks they're intrusive and whatnot. But where you clearly use it. At what point did you realize that no, this is an incredible tool that collects more than I'll ever need, but at least it gives me the choice to be selective of what to leave out at the end and not have to rely on very messy handwriting and missing stuff because you were scribbling so much. I don't know, he's so against it. And how did you come to a place where you were like, no, I am totally for it?
Well, I started using a tape recorder when I was out in California. And so when I came back into that job where I did these long pieces in New Orleans, that was when I really started using the tape recorder for everything, because I was doing these long kinds of things. I want to disagree with McPhee in that I think that it's the writer who has to be selective. And so, I think that, sure, you have everything on the tape recorder, but that's the beauty of it. And it's up to me to be selective. Because I have a 20-page transcript doesn't mean I use 20 pages of what, I might only use 3 lines from it. But I have it there because, I don't know what I'm going to use until I get back and start, writing with it. And I just think that, one, it's so much more accurate, but beyond that, you can really capture the way a person talks when you have a tape recorder. I just think it's such a rich tool, and I also think, a lot of people talk about the dread transcribing, but to me, transcribing is still another point of getting this in your head. Yeah, it's drudgery to do it, but still, it's part of the writing process. It's putting it in my head and planting it there a little bit more. And I'm sorry, Brenda, I think maybe I've gotten off on not answering your point. If there's another point you want me to make?
No, this is great. Like you're making the great case for the recorder, and that's exactly what I hearing the way you've advocated for it and justified it in your own reporting, and it helps me hear it because sometimes I love the recorder for that reason. I don't trust myself to catch everything. There are things I just straight up miss. I'm like, I don't remember him saying that in the conversation, and the recorder caught it for me. And transcribing, it's a bummer to transcribe, but like you said, it's another chance to have the conversations drilled back into your head. And at that point, yes, at 20 pages or 20,000 words, maybe you use 100 out of that, but at least you've given yourself every ample opportunity to use it and not rely on bad handwriting and have to throw stuff out because you can't read your notes.
And the other thing that I find useful with the tape recorder, especially when I'm getting started, or I'm getting started on a new section or a new chapter, or whatever, I like to take the tape recorder, say at night, lay down, put the tape recorder in, turn the light off, turn the tape recorder on, close my eyes, and listen, because it puts me back where I was. Even though I have only the voice, in my mind I can picture us and what we were doing and what was happening. So I find it really helpful sometimes in deciding how I want to start or how I want to do something. You know, it just helps bring it back alive. And that's the other thing, too, is when you're writing a book especially, your tapes, you may not get to that part of the story for a year, depending on how long you're writing this thing. But with the tape recorder, it brings it all back to you like it happened, an hour ago or the night before. It just makes it fresher, I think, in your mind. And I think the same thing with photographs. And actually, I guess I started doing it. I can remember when I did the Klan book, I didn't take pictures. But what I did was pictures from magazines or whatever. I would put them, as I said, behind the wall, behind my at that point, typewriter. I remember one time I had to have something repaired, and I just remember this African-American repairman or somebody coming in, and his eyes getting wide when he sees these pictures of these burning crosses and these people over my computer. But all of that really, for me, was putting me back there so that I could try to write with more immediacy. And but then eventually started taking pictures, and I think Walt Carrington is another believer in tape recorders and photographs, and he really encouraged me, I think, to do more with photographs. And I can't remember exactly. I remember him one scene in this murder story that he wrote for the Post decades ago, The Detectives. And I remember him following the detectives out to some kind of murder scene, and he took this photograph, and it wasn't until he got home and was looking at the photographs that I can't remember if it was a coin, but there was something significant that was on the ground that he hadn't even noticed when he took the photograph, So I just think, and I realize now, there are probably some people who are doing videos. I don't know how that works, but anyway.
The hearing you talk about all this stuff just makes you like the perfect person to have edited this and curated this selection of work from these brilliant women journalists for the stories we tell. And what was the process like for you to go through all these pieces and get them into this wonderful collection? What was that process like for you as you started digging into this kind of work?
Well, I think that I've always kept folders of stories that I liked, that I admired, that I thought were well written, for one reason or another. And I did another anthology in the early 2000s, and it really, again, it was sort of like my favorite pieces. In terms of this, Mike and I talked, and we really wanted a collection of women who had really at the forefront of women's writing in long form. And so I started out really sort of writing down my favorites and favorite writers that I thought ought to be in it, stories that I thought ought to be in it. And then I started talking to editors I know, primarily magazine editors, and asking for their suggestions. And then so they made suggestions again, both of writers and of particular pieces. And then also to other writer friends and people who teach this to get there. So, and then, Mike was putting in some of his people, that he knew that I wasn't familiar with. And, what we were looking for were two things. We wanted not just interesting story material, but also stories that were outstanding for their writing and their reporting, and that demonstrated what's really the fine writing in this genre, what it ought to be like or what it can be like. So those were some of the things that we hope to include, and I think too the goal was two things. One, to pay homage to these women for the work that they've done and are doing, but also to demonstrate. I guess we particularly wanted to inspire younger women to see what you can do, but I don't think I would limit it just to other young women. I think there's a lot for male writers to learn from these women and these stories. So I think that was sort of our goal, to come up with that kind of a collection. And I would say that we probably could have put out an encyclopedia. Mm-hmm. I mean, we really had in the beginning days a long list. And then at some point we decided, okay, we can't do all of this. We will do 2 volumes. I'm not going to, as it turns out, I'm not going to do the second volume. But what we decided to do was to make this volume women who are 50 and older, and that the second volume would be people who are younger than 50. So that took some of the list off, and I don't know, there were just various reasons that we went through. It was really difficult to leave some people off, and we really felt like we should not, that we weren't going to do more than 20, because the book is already. Have you seen the print version of it? It's pretty thick.
No, I have a PDF version, but I think it's close to 400 pages.
Yeah, I don't remember what the page count is, but it's pretty thick.
Yeah.
And so, obviously you had to leave some out. And, I mean, that's one of the difficult things, I think, of doing an anthology. To me, it's harder to let stories go than it is to find good stories. There are just a lot of reasons. I guess of it are just personal taste or whatever. But, the ones that were not included, it's no reflection on those stories or those writers. It was just a matter of practicality, of not being able to have more.
Those tiebreakers had to have been hard for you to decide, because anything they easily could have been included. And what did those tiebreakers look like to you on an individual taste basis?
Yeah, I think that there were times when maybe there was a story that was very similar in subject matter to something we'd already decided on, set on, and so maybe it had to do with subject matter. Maybe it just, the writing was not, to me, as wonderful as one that we used. I don't know. You know, it just, that sort of water under the bridge. But there, you know, I'm really pleased. Well, I'll back up too. I'm leaving this out in terms of where the stories came from. You know, there were some, as I said, that I knew that I wanted to use Joan Didion's Dreamers of the Golden Dream, for instance. To me, that's such a fabulous piece of writing and reporting. I mean, to me, it's just incredible that Joan Didion wasn't there for the trial. She didn't get there till after the trial and after, you know, like a year after the murder. And yet that you would never know it by the writing of that story. So I knew I wanted to use that. And, you know, there are pieces like that. But then we also asked the women that we were approaching do you have a particular favorite that you would like to see us use, or do you have some particular favorite? Because some of them would come back with 2 or 3 stories that they consider their favorites, and then I would read through those and choose a story. What I particularly liked, or what I thought was good for the mix. The writers were all fantastically cooperative and helpful in doing this, and I think there was a great deal of excitement among them, enthusiasm among them for this, that they really felt it was about time that an anthology like this came out. When we got to the end, and Mike was looking and thinking about who to ask to write a blurb for the book, we decided, how can you ask somebody else to write a blurb when we have the women we think are just so the best, in the book. And so we asked the women if they had interest, if they were interested or willing to write a blurb, and we ended up with a bunch of wonderful blurbs from them about the anthology and their role in it and that kind of thing. In choosing the stories, it was sometimes interesting that when somebody made a suggestion, I can think of a couple of times when I thought, just seeing what the subject matter is, I would say to myself, oh God, this is going to be deadly, and then you start reading, but this is the magic of narrative. It was just incredible. It was stunning. And I think of a piece by Mimi Schwartz. Mimi's from Texas Monthly. And her story is mothers, sisters, daughters, wives. And it's about the Texas legislators waging war on Planned Parenthood. And I thought, oh my God, this is going to be deadly. It is a fabulous story. And she does such a beautiful job of capturing the tone and the flavor of, these sessions in the state legislature in Texas and these men. And at any rate, it just, it's wonderful when you come up with something like that, and it just blows you off your feet and you're totally not expecting it. And, I think of also Susanna Lassard's story about Park Avenue, and, she takes the street and writes about this cultural divide, how one half of it is, ghetto, and the other half is, the very wealthy of the wealthiest. It's just a really interesting class thing, study and everything. But anyway, that was some of the magic and some of the fun, too, of making these discoveries of stories that maybe you weren't familiar with, but just sort of really just caught you and held you.
It sounds like it was a lot of fun for you to do this, too, and compile this list.
Yeah, it was. And also beyond the stories, it was fun getting to know these women. Either by phone or internet, and a lot of women that I have never met. Getting to know them, and so that was rewarding, and it was also fun working with Mike. He's so fun to work with. I've enjoyed the project.
Yeah, Patsy, I feel like I could talk to you for another 2 hours, but I need to be respectful of your time. And this is really great to get to hear your story, and also how you work through the story, your reporting process, and then, of course, talking about how you went through and sort of curated this wonderful collection of stories. It's what a great body of work you have, and also what you've done with this the Stories We Tell collection. So thanks for all the work you've done. We'll have to do a part 2 another time where we can dig into some other stuff too. But I think this is wonderful getting to talk to you at length, at least in this early going. So thank you for the time.
You're welcome. Thank you.
You're welcome. Talk to you later, Patsy. Thanks to Patsy Sims for coming on episode 73 of the Creative Nonfiction Podcast. Brilliant insights. Hope you got a lot out of it. If you'd like to maybe have a part 2 and a follow-up with Patsy, just let me know. Ping me on Twitter at Brendan O'Mara. Also, go to BrendanO'Mara.com for past episodes of the podcast, as well as the sign-up sheet for the monthly newsletter, where I give out my recommendations for reading for the month and also what you might have missed from the podcast. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you next week. Thanks.